Welcome to this journey through one of the most disturbing cases recorded in the history of Mobile, Alabama. Before we begin, I invite you to leave in the comments where you're watching from and the exact time at which you're listening to this narration. We're interested in knowing which places and what times of day or night these documented stories reach. The roads leading to Mobile, Alabama in 1842 were dusty arteries that fed into a bustling port city where cotton was king and fortunes were made on the backs of those who had no choice but to serve. The Gulf breeze carried the scent of salt and money, masking something darker that festered beneath the gentile surface of Southern propriety. It was here, in a grand white-columned house on Government Street, that the events we're about to discuss took place. Events that remained buried in municipal records and personal correspondence for over 100 years. According to courthouse documents uncovered during renovations in 1967, Anne Brennan was 23 years old when she married James Delacroix, a wealthy plantation owner 30 years her senior. The Delacroix family was among the oldest in Mobile, tracing their lineage back to the original French settlers. James owned 3 cotton plantations across Alabama and Mississippi, his wealth evident in the three-story mansion that overlooked Mobile Bay. What few people discussed openly was how that fortune was built on the labor of over 200 enslaved individuals who worked the Delacroix lands. Parish records from St. and Mary's Catholic Church indicate that James and Anne were married in 1837 in a lavish ceremony attended by Mobile's elite. Anne came from modest means, her father a clerk at the Port Authority. How she caught the attention of one of Mobile's wealthiest bachelors was the subject of considerable speculation. Some said it was her striking beauty, fair-skinned with auburn hair. Others suggested a more calculated arrangement. A letter found in the personal effects of Josephine Harris, Anne's childhood friend, hinted at something else entirely. Anne confided that she feels as though she has been sold as surely as any other property that changes hands at the marketplace. The letter reads, "Her father's debts were considerable, and Mr. Delacroix has generously offered to settle them in exchange for her hand. She weeps when she thinks no one is watching." The marriage proceeded nonetheless, and Anne took her place among Mobile society as Mrs. James Delacroix. For 5 years, she fulfilled the role expected of a plantation mistress, hosting dinners, managing household staff, and appearing at her husband's side at social gatherings. According to the journal of Margaret Thornton, wife of the local bank president, Anne was always impeccably dressed, but possessed a peculiar quietness that some mistook for haughtiness. Her eyes, however, betrayed a profound sadness that no fine silk could disguise. Among the Delacroix household staff was a man named Isaiah Bennett. According to property records from 1835, Isaiah was purchased by James Delacroix at an auction in New Orleans for the considerable sum of $1,800. The receipt described him as 25 years of age, literate, experienced as a house servant, and skilled in carpentry. What made Isaiah unusual was his status within the household. James had designated him as his personal valet, a position that afforded him privileges denied to others in his condition. Isaiah accompanied James everywhere, managed his correspondence, and even traveled with him to business meetings in New Orleans and Charleston. A notation in James's business ledger, discovered among papers donated to the Mobile Historical Society in 1954, indicated that Isaiah had been educated in secret by a northern tutor James had hired under the guise of managing his accounts. This was, of course, in direct violation of Alabama state law, which prohibited the education of enslaved people. The situation at the Delacroix mansion took a dramatic turn in February of 1842. According to the Mobile Register's obituary, James Delacroix died suddenly at the age of 53. The cause listed was apoplexy, what we would now recognize as a stroke or heart attack. He collapsed in his study late one evening with only Isaiah present at the time of his death. The newspaper noted that Mr. Delacroix's trusted servant summoned the doctor and Mrs. Delacroix, but nothing could be done to revive the gentleman. What followed James's death deviated sharply from the expected course of events. According to his will, filed with the Mobile County Probate Court, Anne was to inherit everything, the mansion, the plantations, and all property therein, a euphemism for the human beings James owned. This was not unusual for the time. What was unusual was a codicil added to the will just 3 months before James's death, stipulating that Isaiah Bennet was to be manumitted, legally freed, and granted a small parcel of land on the edge of the Delacroix property along with a sum of $500. The codicil raised eyebrows among the executives of the estate. Why would James Delacroix, a man who had built his fortune on enslaved labor, single out one individual for freedom and financial independence? The question lingered in the correspondence between Thomas Bradford, James's attorney, and William Harrison, the executive of the estate. There are whispers of impropriety that I dare not commit to paper, Bradford wrote in March of 1842. Suffice it to say that Mr. Delacroix may have had reasons to ensure Bennett's continued well, being that extend beyond the typical master-servant relationship. And Delacroix observed a brief period of mourning before making a series of decisions that scandalized Mobile society. According to property records filed in May of 1842, she sold 2 of the 3 Delacroix plantations along with most of the enslaved workers to a consortium of buyers from Mississippi. She retained only the Mobile mansion and a small farm outside the city where she relocated the remaining household staff. It was during this period that the relationship between Anne and Isaiah began to change in ways that did not escape the notice of those around them. Eliza Johnson, who served as a cook in the Delacroix household, later gave a statement to the Works Progress Administration Federal Writers Project in 1937 when she was over 90 years old. Her testimony, recorded by fieldworker Sarah Collins, offered a rare glimpse into the dynamics of the household during this time. Miss Anne, she start to ask Mr. Isaiah to take his meals in the small dining roomstead of the kitchen with the rest of us, Johnson recalled. Then she have him sit with her in the library evenings reading books. Folks in the house, we know something ain't right, but ain't nobody going to say nothing. Not our place, but people in town, they start to talk when they see him riding beside her in the carriage, not driving it like he's supposed to. The most explosive revelation came in September of 1842, 7 months after James Delacroix's death. According to a letter written by Reverend Michael O'Connor of a small Methodist church outside Mobile, he performed a marriage ceremony between a recently widowed lady of means and a freeman of color formerly in her household's employ. Though the letter did not name Anne and Isaiah directly, the timing and circumstances leave little doubt about the couple's identity. The marriage was, of course, illegal under Alabama law. Interracial marriage was prohibited throughout the South with severe penalties for those who violated this taboo. That Anne and Isaiah found a minister willing to perform the ceremony at all is remarkable. The Reverend's letter, discovered among church records during a 1963 archival project, suggests he was aware of the transgression. I performed this union knowing full well earthly consequences I might face, but answering to a higher authority than the laws of men. The sincerity of their attachment to one another was evident, and I could not in good conscience deny them the blessing they sought. News of the marriage spread quickly through mobile society. The reaction was swift and severe. According to City Council minutes from October 1842, a committee of concerned citizens petitioned for Anne to be removed from the Delqua property on grounds of moral turpitude and violation of public decency. The petition was signed by 42 prominent Mobile residents, including several who had been guests at Anne's dinner table only months before. What happened next has been pieced together from fragmentary sources. The Mobile Sheriff's daily log contains an entry from October 12, 1842, dispatched deputies to the Delquire residence on Government Street regarding reports of unlawful cohabitation. Upon arrival found the house empty of occupants. Evidence suggests hasty departure. A notice placed in the Mobile Register on October 20th offers a $500 reward for information leading to the whereabouts of Isaiah Bennett, a Negro man fraudulently claiming freedom, and Andiqua widow believed to be traveling in his company. The notice was placed by William Harrison, the executive of James Decro's estate, who claimed that Anne had absconded with valuables belonging to the estate, and that Isaiah had exercised undue influence over a woman in a vulnerable state. The trail goes cold after this point. There is no record of Anne or Isaiah's capture, nor any indication they were ever found. Their disappearance became the subject of intense speculation. Some suggested they had fled to New Orleans, where a community of free people of color and more relaxed social boundaries might have offered some protection. Others believed they had made their way north to Boston or even Canada. A more sinister theory voiced in private correspondence between the sheriff and the mayor was that frontier justice had been served by those unwilling to tolerate such a flagrant violation of social order. In 1867, 25 years after their disappearance, a curious document surfaced in a Cincinnati probate court. A woman named Anne Bennett, described as a widow of fair complexion, had died of consumption, leaving a modest estate to her son James. The document mentioned that Anne had come to Cincinnati in 1843 with her husband Isaiah, who had established a successful carpentry business before his death in 1859. While there is no definitive proof that Anne and Isaiah Bennett of Cincinnati were the same Anne and Isaiah who fled Mobile, the coincidence is compelling. Perhaps the most intriguing piece of evidence came to light in 1958, when a family Bible was donated to the Mobile Historical Society by a woman who claimed to be a distant relative of the Delqua family. The Bible contained a family tree with an entry for Andiqua listing her death as unknown. Beside it, written in a different hand and ink, was a small notation, "Found peace at last." Whether this was wishful thinking on the part of a family member or based on actual knowledge remains a mystery. What drove to make such a drastic choice? The few personal documents that survive offer tantalizing clues. A page from what appears to be Anne's diary preserved in the Mobile Historical Society archives contains this passage from January 1842, a month before James's death. "I cannot continue to live in this way. Surrounded by suffering, I am powerless to alleviate. J grows more distant each day, retreating into his ledgers and his whiskey. Only I sees me as I truly am, sees the cage in which I live, gilded though it may be. We spoke today of places far from here where people might live differently. It was just talk, dreams that dissolve in the light of day, but for moment I could breathe. The relationship between Anne and Isaiah raises profound questions about power, agency, and the possibility of genuine connection across the brutal divides of the antebellum South. As a young woman effectively sold into marriage to settle family debts, Anne experienced a form of bondage different from but parallel to Isaiah's enslavement. Did they find in each other a recognition of shared humanity that transcended their prescribed roles, or was their relationship itself shaped by the unequal power dynamics of the society in which they lived? Some historians have suggested that Anne's decision to free and marry Isaiah was an act of rebellion against the system that had constrained her own choices. Others question whether Isaiah, despite his unusual education and status, could ever have freely chosen a relationship with someone who had until recently held legal ownership of him. These questions cannot be definitively answered with the limited evidence available, but they remind us of the complex human realities that existed within systems of oppression. The Delqua mansion still stands on Government Street in Mobile, though it has changed hands many times since 1842. According to local legend, visitors sometimes report hearing hushed conversations from empty rooms or glimpsing the figure of a woman in 19th-century dress looking out from the third-floor windows. Skeptics attribute these stories to the natural creaks and shadows of an old house, amplified by knowledge of its history. What cannot be disputed is that the walls of that house witnessed a relationship that defied the rigid boundaries of its time. The story of Anne Delqua and Isaiah Bennett has largely faded from public memory. It exists now primarily in fragmented documents and the whispered stories passed down by those who worked to preserve Mobile's complex history. Their fate, whether they found the freedom they sought or paid a terrible price for their transgression, remains unknown. What survives is the echo of a choice made against overwhelming odds, a choice that reveals both the rigid constraints of history and the persistent human drive to challenge them. In 1966, during the height of the civil rights movement, a graduate student at Howard University named Marcus Johnson wrote a thesis on interracial relationships in the antebellum South. In his conclusion, he reflected on Anne and Isaiah's story. Their choices cannot be romanticized or simplified. They lived in a time of profound moral contradictions, and we cannot know the full complexity of their motives or feelings. What we do know is that they looked at the world built around them, with all its rigid certainties about who could love whom, who could be free, who could choose, and they rejected it. In doing so, they inscribed a question mark on history that still challenges us today. The Delqua mansion was sold again in 1968 to a historical preservation society. During renovations, workers discovered a small space beneath the floorboards of the master bedroom containing a man's carpentry tools and a woman's silver hairbrush. There was no way to determine when these items had been hidden there or by whom. The discovery was noted in the renovation records, and items were placed in storage where they remained until the collection was catalogued in 1972. By then, they were simply artifacts from another time, their significance forgotten. Some stories resist a neat conclusion. They remain open-ended, like a sentence trailing off into silence. What happened to Anne and Isaiah after they fled Mobile? Did they find the new life they sought, or did they meet a darker fate on the road north? Did they truly choose each other freely, or were their choices inevitably warped by the unequal world they inhabited? The official record offers no definitive answers. What we do know is that in the autumn of 1842, a woman born into privilege and a man born into bondage disappeared from Mobile, leaving behind the ruins of one life in search of another. Their story survives in fragments, a marriage certificate signed by a consigned Sestrican minister, a diary page, speaking of dreams that dissolve in the light of day. A small notation in a family Bible, found peace at last. Perhaps in the end that uncertain peace is all anyone can hope for. The freedom to write one's own story, even knowing it may end mid-sentence, in the quiet rooms of the Delqua mansion. Now a museum open to the public, visitors sometimes pause in the former master bedroom, feeling a strange sense of being watched. Tour guides tell them about James Dequa, the wealthy plantation owner, and mention in passing that his widow disappeared under mysterious circumstances. What they don't say is that in this very room, a woman once wrote in her secret diary about places far from here where people might live differently. They don't tell visitors that beneath the restored floorboards, researchers once found a silver hairbrush and a set of carpenter's tools hidden side by side. Like a promise, some stories are best left as whispers echoing faintly through time. The road leading away from Mobile was long and uncertain in 1842. We don't know if Anne and Isaiah traveled it together or what they found at its end, but their disappearance left a silence in the historical record that speaks volumes about the world they left behind, a world that could not contain or categorize what existed between them, and perhaps that silence, that absence is its own kind of testimony. In 1959, a retired history professor from Tuskegee Institute, named Dr. Lawrence Wilson, began researching what he called lost narratives of the antebellum South. His particular interest lay in relationships that crossed the rigid racial boundaries of the time, relationships that were often deliberately obscured in official records. Among the cases he investigated was that of Anne and Isaiah. Dr. Wilson's research notes donated to the Alabama State Archives after his death in 1964 contain interviews with elderly residents of Mobile whose grandparents had been contemporaries of the Delqua household. One such interview with 87-year-old Clara Wilkins offers a perspective rarely captured in official documents. According to M.S. Wilkins, her grandmother had worked as a laundress for several wealthy families in Mobile, including the Delqua family. Grandma said that Miss Ann wasn't like the other ladies, Wilkins recalled. She would speak directly to the house staff. Look them in the eye. Mr. Delicia didn't like it, but she did it anyway when he wasn't watching. And she and that Isaiah, they had a way of communicating without words. A glance across the room and they understood each other. People noticed, but no one said anything while the master was alive, Doctor. Wilson also uncovered a deposition given to Mobile authorities in November of 1842 by Thomas Jenkins, a dock worker who claimed to have seen a white woman and a colored man boarding a merchant vessel bound for New Orleans in mid-October. Jenkins stated that the man carried himself like no field hand and the woman kept her face hidden beneath a veil, but her hands were soft and pale. The authorities apparently did not consider this lead worth pursuing, perhaps because by then Anne and Isaiah had already been gone for several weeks. The merchant vessel in question, the Carolina Star, maintained cargo manifests that were preserved in the New Orleans Port Authority archives. The manifest from October 18, 1842 lists among its passengers Mr. and Mrs. Smith, with no further identifying information. Whether this generic alias concealed the identities of Anne and Isaiah is impossible to determine with certainty, but the timing aligns with their disappearance from Mobile. New Orleans in 1842 was a cosmopolitan port city with a complex social structure that included a substantial population of free people of color, many of whom owned property and businesses. The city French and Spanish heritage had created social customs different from those in the rest of the American South. While still deeply unequal and shaped by racism and slavery, New Orleans offered more fluid social boundaries and possibilities for those who existed between the stark categories of black and white, slave and free. Parish records from St. Augustine Catholic Church in New Orleans, which served a predominantly black congregation, include a baptismal record from February 1843 for James Smith, infant son of Isaiah and Anne Smith. The child's godparents are listed as Marie Laveau, a famous voodoo practitioner who was also a respected member of the free black community, and Louis Dupré, a French merchant. This tantalizing document raises the possibility that Anne was already pregnant when she and Isaiah fled Mobile, adding another dimension to their urgent departure. If Anne and Isaiah did indeed establish themselves in New Orleans under the name Smith, they left few other traces in official records. This is perhaps unsurprising, as they would have had every reason to maintain a low profile. William Harrison, the executive of James Decro's estate, had advertised a substantial reward for their capture, and slave catchers were known to operate in New Orleans, looking for fugitives who had escaped from plantations throughout the South. A possible glimpse of their life appears in the business directory for New Orleans from 1845, which lists an I. Smith, cabinet maker with a workshop on Rampart Street in an area where many skilled free black artisans maintained businesses. The directory notes that Smith specialized in fine furniture in the French style and had recently completed commissions for several distinguished families. Isaiah's carpentry skills, mentioned in the original bill of sale when James Decroix purchased him, would have provided a means of supporting a family in New Orleans. The next documentary trace appears in Cincinnati, Ohio in 1852. The city directory lists an Isaiah Bennett cabinet maker with a workshop on 6th Street. While Ben, it is not an uncommon name, the profession matches, and Cincinnati was a known destination for those fleeing the South. Situated just across the Ohio River from Kentucky, a slave state, the city had a substantial free black community and was an important stop on the Underground Railroad, the network that helped enslaved people escape to freedom. A deed of sale recorded in Hamilton County, Ohio in 1854 shows that Isaiah Bennett purchased a modest house on Elm Street for $650. The document describes him as a free man of color and his wife as Anne Bennett, formerly of Louisiana. This would align with a narrative in which Anne and Isaiah initially fled to New Orleans before eventually moving north as tensions over slavery intensified throughout the 1840s and 1850s. Church records from the 6th Street Methodist Episcopal Church in Cincinnati include mentions of the Bennett family attending services between 1854 and 1858. The church was known for its abolitionist stance and welcomed both black and white congregants, though seating was typically segregated. A notation in the pastor's journal from Christmas of 1856 mentions the Bennett family's generous donation of a finely crafted communion table, the work of Mr. Bennett's own hands. The final definitive record of Isaiah appears to be his death certificate, filed in Cincinnati in July of 1859. The cause of death is listed as consumption, the contemporary term for tuberculosis. Isaiah was described as approximately 45 years of age and by occupation a cabinet maker. His wife Anne Bennett is named as his next of kin, along with their son James, aged 16, and daughter Mary Ede, 14. If Mary was born after the family's arrival in Cincinnati, This would align with the timeline of their departure from Mobile. Anne Bennett's death certificate from 1867 lists her as a widow aged approximately 48 years, which would correspond with Anne Dequa's age. The document notes that she was buried in Cincinnati's Spring Grove Cemetery, though attempts to locate her grave in the 1960s were unsuccessful, possibly due to poor record-keeping or the use of an unmarked grave. The fate of James and Mary Bennett, the children of Isaiah and Anne, remains largely unknown. A census record from 1870 shows a James Bennett, male mulatto, aged 27, working as a carpenter in Philadelphia. The same census lists Mary Bennett Wilson, female mulatto, aged 25, living with her husband, John Wilson, a porter, also in Philadelphia. Whether these individuals were indeed the children of Isaiah and Anne is impossible to confirm with certainty, but the ages, professions, and locations align with what might be expected for their children. If James and Mary Bennett did establish lives in Philadelphia after the Civil War, they would have entered a society still deeply divided by race, but one in which their legal status as free citizens was at least nominally protected by the 14th and 15th Amendments. Story of their parents, a white woman and a formerly enslaved black man who defied the laws and social codes of their time, may have been one they chose to keep private, a family secret too dangerous or painful to share openly. The story of Anne Dequoy and Isaiah Bennett exists in the margins of history, pieced together from fragmentary documents and suggestive silences in the official record. Their journey from the rigid hierarchies of Mobile to the relative freedoms of Cincinnati traces a path across the American landscape during one of its most divided periods. Their choices made at tremendous personal risk challenge simplistic narratives about the antebellum South and remind us that even within systems of brutal oppression, individuals sometimes found ways to assert their humanity and pursue their own definitions of freedom and connection. The Dequoy mansion in Mobile continued to change hands throughout the late 19th and early 20th centuries. During the Civil War, it was briefly occupied by Union officers after the capture of Mobile in 1865. In the 1920s, it served as a boarding house, its grandeur fading as the neighborhood around it declined. By the 1950s, it had fallen into disrepair, targeted for demolition until the Mobile Historical Preservation Society intervened to save it. Today, the restored mansion serves as a museum with tours that focus primarily on its architectural significance and the general lifestyle of wealthy antebellum families. The specific story of Anne and Isaiah is rarely mentioned, relegated to a brief note in the museum's guidebook about the mysterious disappearance of James Dequoy's widow. Perhaps this is appropriate. Their story, after all, was one they chose to erase from public view, replacing the identities assigned to them with ones of their own creation. Yet, traces of their presence linger in unexpected places. In 2003, during another round of renovations to the mansion, workers discovered a small compartment behind the fireplace in the master bedroom. Inside was a leather pouch containing several items: a silver thimble engraved with the initials A.B., possibly Anne Brennan, Anne's maiden name, a wooden ruler marked with the initials I.B., and a folded piece of paper that had deteriorated too much to be legible. These items were catalogued and placed in the museum's archives, their significance noted, but not emphasized in the mansion's official history. The historian Catherine Reynolds, in her 2008 book, Intimate Transgressions, Forbidden Relationships in the Antebellum South, dedicates a chapter to Anne and Isaiah's story. She argues that their relationship represents not an anomaly, but Rather, one documented instance of connections that likely occurred more frequently than official records acknowledge. Reynolds suggests that the power imbalance inherent in Anne and Isaiah's positions, she as the mistress of the household, he as legally her property even before James's death, complicates any romantic narrative of their relationship. We cannot know the nature of their feelings for each other. Reynolds writes, "What we do know is that both Anne and Isaiah chose to leave behind everything familiar. She a position of relative privilege. He whatever community ties he had established even within the constraints of enslavement to forge a life together somewhere else. Whether driven by love, pragmatism, or a complex mixture of both, their choice represents a rejection of the social order that defined their world." Perhaps the most poignant artifact associated with Anne and Isaiah's story came to light in 1969, when a descendant of the Cincinnati Bennett donated a family Bible to the Ohio Historical Society. The Bible, printed in 1846, contains a family record section with births, marriages, and deaths recorded in a careful hand. The first entry reads, "Isaiah Bennett and Ann Bennett, united in the sight of God, September 1842. Below that are the birth dates for James Bennett, August 1843, and Mary Bennett, June 1845. What makes this document remarkable is not just what it records, but what it omits. There is no mention of Mobile, of Delacroix, of a previous marriage, or of enslavement. The family history begins with Isaiah and Anne's union as if nothing existed before that moment. It is a document of self-creation, of a family writing its own origin story in defiance of the one society had written for them. On the inside cover of the Bible is an inscription in a different hand, presumably added by a later descendant. This Bible belonged to my great-grandparents Isaiah and Ann Bennett. They came north before the war and established our family in freedom. Whatever came before, they left behind. It is perhaps the most fitting epitaph for a couple who risked everything to rewrite their story. The neighborhood in Cincinnati, where Isaiah and Ann Bennett made their home, has changed dramatically since the 19th century. Urban renewal projects in the 1960s demolished many of the original buildings, including the site of Isaiah's workshop on 6th Street. The house they purchased on Elm Street was replaced by an apartment building in the 1970s. No historical marker notes their presence. No official commemoration acknowledges their journey. In 2017, a graduate student at the University of Cincinnati named Eliza Bennett, who believes herself to be a direct descendant of Isaiah and Anne, completed a dissertation titled "Chosen Families: Alternative Kinship Networks in 19th Century America." In her acknowledgments, she writes, "I dedicate this work to Isaiah and Anne, who chose each other against all odds, and in doing so made my existence possible." The true nature of Anne and Isaiah's relationship, whether it represented genuine affection, mutual advantage, or some combination of factors shaped by the power dynamics of their time, remains impossible to determine with certainty. Yet their story persists, carried forward by historians, archivists, and descendants who recognize in it something essential about America's complex past. What is clear is that they made choices that placed them outside the accepted boundaries of their society. choices that required courage, desperation, or perhaps both. In the end, perhaps the most remarkable aspect of their story is not what they left behind, but what they created. A life together that, while undoubtedly marked by the traumas they had experienced and the ongoing racism of 19th century America, existed on terms they had chosen for themselves. The historical record suggests that they succeeded at least partially in their reinvention, establishing a home, raising children, building a small place in a new community where they were known simply as the Bennett family, cabinet maker and wife, members of the 6th Street Methodist Episcopal Church, donors of a finely crafted communion table. The story of Andulqua and Isaiah Bennett reminds us that history is not merely a record of grand events and social forces, but also of individual lives lived in the margins, of personal choices made within and against the constraints of time and place. Their journey from the Delacroix mansion on Government Street to a modest house on Elm Street traces a path across not just the physical landscape of 19th century America, but across its moral and social terrain as well. As visitors walk through the restored rooms of the Delacroix mansion today, they see the carefully preserved artifacts of antebellum wealth, the imported furniture, the silver candelabra, the portraits of stern-faced patriarchs. What they don't see are the hidden spaces where Anne might have written in her secret diary, or where Isaiah might have paused to consider the carpentry tools that represented both his skill and a possible future beyond enslavement. They don't see the small compartment behind the fireplace where someone, Anne or Isaiah, or both, concealed those personal items found during renovations in 2003. The silver thimble, the wooden ruler, the folded note whose contents are lost to time. These absences in the historical record, these silences and gaps, are themselves a kind of testimony. They speak to lives lived deliberately beyond the reach of documentation, to choices made to escape rather than confront an unjust system. Anne and Isaiah chose erasure as a form of freedom, disappearing from the narrative assigned to them in order to write their own. In a sense, their story continues to unfold even now as historians, descendants, and others work to recover it from fragments and silences. Each new document discovered, each oral history recorded, each artifact preserved adds another dimension to our understanding of who they were and what drove them to make such momentous choices. The story will never be complete. Too much has been lost to time. Too much was deliberately obscured, but in its incompleteness lies a truth about how history is made and remade, remembered and forgotten by those who live it and those who come after. The last known record associated with Isaiah and Anne Benn. It is the death certificate for Anne filed in Cincinnati in 1867. After that, they exist only in the traces left in their children's lives, in family stories passed down through generations, in the scattered artifacts preserved by chance or care. Perhaps this too is fitting. They sought to disappear from one narrative in order to appear in another of their own creation. In the end, they succeeded in both erasure and preservation, becoming ghosts in one history and ancestors in another. As the sun sets over Mobile Bay, casting long shadows across the manicured lawns of the Delacroix mansion, one might imagine Anne standing at an upstairs window, looking out toward the water and the world beyond. One might imagine Isaiah in the carriage house, carefully planing a piece of wood, his skilled hands creating something beautiful from raw material. One might imagine a glance exchanged, a decision made, a future glimpsed, not perfect, not without risk or pain, but their own. The road leading north from Mobil was long and uncertain in 1842. We know that Anne and Isaiah traveled it together, and we have glimpses of what they found at its end. A modest home, 2 children, a place in a new community, a family Bible recording their union without reference to what came before. It is not a complete story, not a perfect resolution, but it is something precious and rare. A moment when 2 people looked at the world built around them with all its seemingly immutable boundaries and chose to imagine something different. In the Bennett Family Bible, beneath the list of births and deaths, is a handwritten note added perhaps by Isaiah or Anne or one of their descendants. It reads simply, "Remember that you come from people who chose freedom, whatever the cost." It is a statement of both history and aspiration, a recognition of the past and a charge to the future. It is perhaps the truest legacy of Anne Diakwa and Isaiah Bennett. Not the mansion that still stands on Government Street, but the courage to imagine a different way of being in the world and the will to pursue it.